in the dusty yard of Willowbrook Plantation, on a chilly November morning in 1856. A 12-year-old boy named Samuel knelt in front of the owner. The sun was already up, but it gave no warmth. Samuel's hands were pressed together so hard his knuckles went pale. He had nothing to protect himself with, no knife, no friends, no grown-up to speak for him, only the prayer he had learned from his mother. He truly believed that if he asked God with his whole heart, something might change. The owner, Mr. Thaddeus Harroff, stood over him. He was a heavy man in his 40s, with a thick mustache and cold eyes. To him, Samuel was not a child. He was property that had broken a rule. Thaddeus laughed at the boy's trembling voice. In his mind, showing mercy would mean losing power, and he could never allow that. Willowbrook lay in southern Georgia. Endless rows of cotton stretched in every direction, broken only by rough fences and rows of tiny, crowded cabins where the enslaved families lived. Thaddeus ruled the place like a king. He honestly believed some people were born to give orders, and others were born to take them. Samuel had been born on that same plantation. His mother, Martha, worked inside the big house, and had learned long ago to keep quiet and stay out of sight. Samuel's father had been sold away when the boy was only 4. All Samuel could remember of him was a low, gentle singing voice at night. Samuel had grown up working the fields and staying as invisible as possible. Being noticed almost always meant pain. 2 days earlier, everything had fallen apart. Samuel's mother was sick, and the weekly food ration had been cut again. Hunger hurt so badly that Samuel slipped into the pantry and took a single piece of bread. The overseer, Jacob, a black man, who had been given a little authority, found the bread hidden under Samuel's mattress. Jacob dragged the boy straight to the big house. Everyone knew Samuel had stolen because he was starving, but that did not matter. Stealing was stealing, and Thaddeus Harroff hated anything that looked like disobedience. That morning, every person on the plantation was ordered to the yard to watch the punishment. Thaddeus liked everyone to see what happened when someone stepped out of line. Tired men, women, and children formed a half circle with their eyes on the ground. Martha stood among them, clutching an old rag, moving her lips in silent prayer. Jacob shoved Samuel into the center. Thaddeus walked slowly down the porch steps, enjoying the moment. He carried a coiled whip in his hand, but did not plan to use it right away. First came the talking. He wanted everyone to hear how ungrateful the boy was, how he had been given food and a place to sleep, yet repaid kindness with theft. Every word was meant to remind the crowd exactly who was in charge. Then Samuel did something no one expected. Instead of begging the master for mercy, he dropped to his knees, clasped his hands, and started praying out loud to God, not to Thaddeus. His voice was small at first, then stronger. He talked about the hunger, about his sick mother, about how unfair everything was. He asked God to see them, to help them, to set them free. For one short second, Thaddeus looked confused. Then he got angry. He burst out laughing, a hard, mean laugh that rang across the yard. He told Samuel he was foolish to think God cared about slaves. He said prayers never filled an empty stomach or broke iron chains. Jacob laughed too, though it sounded forced. A couple of the white overseers on the porch joined in. Their laughter was meant to crush any hope anyone still had. But while the laughter was still echoing, strange things started to happen. The big dogs that always followed Thaddeus everywhere suddenly stopped in their tracks. They stared toward the line of trees at the edge of the fields. Their ears went back and they began to whimper. Thaddeus's favorite mastiff, the one he used to scare people, dropped flat on the ground and covered its nose with its paws. Shaking like it was afraid, Thaddeus stopped laughing. He frowned at the dogs. Jacob took a step backward, looking around nervously. The workers started whispering. The air itself felt different, heavier, colder, though the sun was shining. The soft morning breeze died away. Leaves hung perfectly still. Even the birds went quiet. Everything seemed to pause, like the whole world was listening. Samuel lifted his face. The fear was gone. A calm, almost happy look came over him. His hands relaxed. A small, peaceful smile appeared on his lips, as if someone he trusted had just whispered that everything would be all right. Thaddeus saw that smile and felt a chill he could not explain. He stepped back without meaning to. His voice cracked when he yelled for Jacob to fetch cold water, claiming the boy had lost his mind in the sun. But everyone could tell the master no longer sounded sure of himself. Martha pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears ran down her cheeks. Yet they were not only tears of fear, something bigger was shining through them then. Out of nowhere, a deep, low sound rolled across the yard. No one could tell if it came from the ground beneath their feet or from high up in the sky. It grew slowly, steady, and powerful, and every person there felt it in their chest, and that was only the beginning. The sound wasn't just one thing. It started low, like a hum you felt in your bones, then grew into something that sounded like far-off thunder, mixed with hundreds of voices speaking words no one could understand. It got louder and louder until every person in that yard felt it thumping inside their ribs. People looked around, scared. A few took slow steps backward. Jacob let the whip slip from his fingers and stared at Thaddeus, waiting for the master to tell him what to do. But Thaddeus couldn't move. For the first time in his life, real fear showed on his face. Then Samuel stood up. No one pushed him. No one pulled him. He simply rose to his feet, as if gentle hands had lifted him. Now the tall, heavy master looked small, and the 12-year-old boy looked tall. Samuel looked Thaddeus straight in the eye. There was no hate in the boy's eyes, only a calm, steady light that seemed too big for a child. When Samuel spoke, his voice was quiet but strong, the kind of strong that makes everyone listen. "You have been weighed," he said, "and you have been found wanting. Cruelty always has a price. That price is coming due today. Chains made by men cannot stand forever when a greater justice is watching." Then he said the words that turned the blood cold in every listener. "Freedom is riding here right now." Thaddeus tried to laugh it off, but the laugh stuck in his throat. Before he could force out a single mocking word, they all heard it: hoofbeats. Dozens of them, coming fast down the main road. Dust rose in a cloud beyond the gate. Jacob ran to the fence, looked, and turned white as ash. He tried to shout something, but no clear words came out. Thaddeus stumbled forward to see for himself, and his knees nearly gave way. 20 federal soldiers in blue uniforms were galloping straight toward the plantation. Rifles gleamed in the morning light. At the front road, an officer holding a thick roll of papers. Behind the soldiers came a closed carriage and 2 more officers. This was no friendly visit. The soldiers poured through the gate without slowing down. The lead officer swung off his horse, walked straight to Thaddeus, took off his hat for half a second out of habit, and unrolled the top paper. Without wasting words, he started reading in a clear, steady voice. It was a federal search and seizure order. The government had evidence that Thaddeus Harav was holding people who had been smuggled into the country after the slave trade, was outlawed serious federal crimes. Soldiers were authorized to search every building and take anything that proved the charges. Thaddeus opened his mouth to argue, to shout that it was all a mistake, but the words died. 3 years earlier, he had quietly bought a group of people brought in secretly from Cuba. He thought the deal was buried deep, that money and distance would keep him safe. Someone had talked. Now, the bill had come. The officer gave a short nod, and the soldiers spread out like they had practiced it 100 times. Some marched into the big house. Others headed for the cabins and barns. 2 soldiers stepped in front of Thaddeus when he tried to follow them inside. Calm but firm, he was not to get in the way. Jacob saw which way the wind was blowing and tried to slip toward the trees. A soldier caught him by the arm before he made 10 steps. The people who had lived under Thaddeus's rule stood silent, afraid to believe what they were seeing. The world they knew, cruel but steady, was breaking apart in front of them. Samuel never moved from his spot. He watched everything with the same quiet face. Martha hurried to him, grabbed his arm gently, and whispered his name over and over. He turned, looked at her with clear eyes, and said softly, "I asked for help, Mama. Help came." She pulled him close and held on tight, tears running down her face. Inside the big house, the soldiers found what they came for: ledgers hidden behind false panels, letters, receipts, proof of payments to smugglers. In a locked cellar they found new arrivals still chained. People who had crossed the ocean in secret and were waiting to be sold on to other farms. When the officer walked back out with the stack of papers, he told Thaddeus he was under arrest. The plantation was now in federal hands until the courts decided what happened next. Strong hands put iron cuffs on Thaddeus' hair of the same kind of iron he had locked on others for years. He dropped to his knees in the same dirt where Samuel had knelt minutes earlier, only this time there was no prayer in it, just shock and despair. While the former master was led away, the officers started explaining what would happen to everyone else. Because these people had been held illegally, the government had a program still new, still full of problems, but real. Some would be moved to free communities up north. Others would get papers saying they were legally free. It wasn't the full freedom anyone dreamed of, and it came with 100 new struggles. But it was a door that had never been opened before. Some people cried out loud. Some stood perfectly still, too stunned to make a sound. A few looked afraid. Freedom can be as scary as chains when you've never touched it. Martha held Samuel even closer. She realized her little boy might grow up in a world she could barely imagine. One of the soldiers walked past Samuel. The boy looked up and said, "Clear as day. Thank you, sir." The soldier stopped, surprised. "Thank me, son. I'm just doing my job." "Why thank me?" Samuel smiled the same quiet smile. "Because I asked God for help this morning, and you showed up right on time." The soldier was a grown man who had seen battle and hardship. He didn't go to church much and didn't believe in miracles, but he knew the papers in his saddlebag had been signed 3 weeks earlier. He knew the raid had been planned for days. And yet here they were, riding through the gate exactly when that child finished praying. He looked at Samuel's steady eyes and felt something he couldn't name. He just touched the brim of his hat and walked on. In the weeks that followed, word of that morning traveled from plantation to plantation. Some said the boy had special power. Some said it was the strangest luck anyone had ever seen. People who wanted everything to stay the same tried to hush the story up. They knew hope was dangerous. But some stories refused to stay quiet. They get passed along in whispers after dark, carried from cabin to cabin like a candle no wind can blow out. Martha and Samuel were sent to a small settlement of free black families in Tennessee. Life there was hard, money was scarce, neighbors were often unkind, and legal freedom didn't magic away a lifetime of hurt. But every night, Martha watched her son fall asleep without chains on the door, and she knew something had changed forever. And somewhere, on quiet evenings, mothers still tell their children about the morning a 12-year-old boy knelt in the dirt, prayed out loud, and the soldiers came riding in before the echo of his amen had even faded away. Freedom on paper didn't erase hatred. It didn't stop white shopkeepers from refusing to sell to Samuel. Didn't keep night riders from burning crosses. Didn't make schools open their doors or jobs appear. Samuel grew up facing the same ugly looks, the same closed doors, the same quiet understanding that being free and being equal were two very different things. But he grew up free. He carried his own last name. He decided for himself what work to take and what church to attend. His future wasn't owned by another man's mood, and through every hard year, his faith never shook. He told the story every chance he got. He told how he had knelt in the red Georgia dirt as a scared 12-year-old, how he had prayed out loud, and how minutes later, hoofbeats thundered, and blue-coated soldiers rode in like the answer itself had spurs and a rifle. He never claimed he made the soldiers come. He simply said he had asked, and they had shown up right on time. When Samuel grew into a man, he became a preacher. Not the kind who stood in tall steepled churches with stained glass windows, but the kind who preached in people's front rooms, under trees, in barns that smelled of hay and coal oil lamps. Wherever folks gathered, needing a word of strength, Samuel was there. He always came back to that one morning, proof that prayers get heard, proof that no chain is forever, proof that God or justice, or both, keeps better time than any oppressor ever expects. Some people listened and smiled politely, thinking it was just a good story. Others hung on every word, like it was water in a dry land. Either way, they remembered. Thaddeus Haroff stood trial, lost everything, and spent his last years broke and angry. He died in a rented room, still insisting he had been cheated by liars and politicians. Yet on certain nights, when the whiskey was strong and the room was empty, he told barroom strangers about a boy who prayed and soldiers who came out of nowhere. He always called it coincidence, but his voice shook a little, like part of him wasn't so sure. Jacob, the overseer, got out of jail after a few months. There wasn't enough proof to keep him. He wandered from job to job. Black communities turned their backs. White planters didn't trust a man who had helped bring one of their own down. Some say years later, he looked up Samuel, wanting to say he was sorry. Some say he never did. Like so many things from that time, nobody knows for sure. Willowbrook Plantation itself was chopped up and sold off to pay debts. Not one person who had worked those fields from sunrise to dark ever received a single acre. That part of the story followed the old, cruel rules. No surprise, no miracle. But people still say the exact spot where Samuel knelt stays bare. Grass won't grow there. Flowers die quick, like the ground soaked up too much pain to give anything back. And on quiet November mornings, when the fog hangs low, folks swear you can hear a low murmur, prayers, maybe, or just the wind remembering. Was it God? Was it the best timed coincidence in history? Was it an anonymous letter, a clerk in Washington who did his job, and a company of soldiers who happened to ride that day? Everyone picks the answer that fits their heart. What nobody argues about is this: for 10 impossible minutes, everything Thaddeus Haroff believed about the world came crashing down. A man who thought himself untouchable watched his kingdom slip away, while a child's prayer still hung in the air. That moment cracked the idea that some people are born to rule forever, and others are born only to obey. Samuel's story lives on because every one of us, sooner or later, stands in front of some kind of Thaddeus, a boss, a system, a sickness, a fear that laughs at our hope and tells us nothing will ever change. In those moments we have to decide, do we keep our heads down, or do we kneel not in surrender, but in stubborn faith, and ask for something better? The soldiers didn't ride in because Samuel waved a magic wand. They rode in because someone, somewhere, wrote a letter, because a few people in uniforms followed orders, because laws, slow and imperfect, still existed. The real wonder wasn't just the timing, it was the meeting of a boy's courage with the quiet work of people he never met. Prayer and action shook hands that morning, and the walls came tumbling down. Samuel lived to be 72. He never got rich. His name never appeared in big city newspapers. But he married, raised children, held grandchildren on his knee, children who never once heard a chain rattle at the door. And every Sunday, somewhere in a little Tennessee holler, an old man with kind eyes and a steady voice would stand up and tell about the day a 12-year-old refused to believe a whip had the final say. That, in the end, was the miracle that no one can explain away. A child looked death in the face, chose hope anyway, and the world bent just enough to let tomorrow begin. Every single time Samuel finished telling the story, whether to a handful of neighbors on a porch or to a packed barn on a Sunday evening, he closed it the same way. He would lean forward a little, lower his voice so everyone had to lean in too, and say, "I wasn't special. Not one bit. What happened that morning didn't happen because I was braver or holier than anybody else. It happened because, right then, I flat out refused to believe that Thaddeus Harrow's whip was the last word over my life. In that one moment I said no to what looked possible and made room for the impossible to walk in. That's all any of us can ever do, say no to the lie that cruelty gets the final say." Then he would sit back, smile soft and tired, and the room would stay quiet a long time. The courtyard where it all began is grown over now, but the story never died. It passed from mouth to mouth, mother to child, preacher to congregation, and every telling carried the same stubborn message. No wall is high enough, no chain strong enough, no laugh cruel enough to outlast a heart that still dares to hope. After that November morning, Samuel and Martha settled in a little valley in eastern Tennessee with other families who had made it out of bondage one way or another. Their houses were rough logs chinked with mud, roofs that leaked in hard rains, but the doors belonged to them, and that made all the difference. Samuel worked as a carpenter, a field hand, whatever paid an honest wage. The first time a white man handed him money and said, "You can walk away if the job don't suit you," Samuel stood there stunned. He was 20 years old before he truly understood that no was a word he was allowed to use. Martha lived to see Samuel marry a quiet, strong woman named Grace, who had survived a plantation over in Alabama. She lived to bounce her first grandbaby on her knee and 2 stitch quilts she sold at the market with her own 2 hands. On warm evenings, she sat on the porch and told the story again, how the dogs lay down, how the wind stopped, how the soldiers came riding in right on time. Some folks smiled and nodded, some shook their heads and figured an old woman's memory had gone soft. Samuel never argued. He just said, "I was there, Mama. You got every word right." When the news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Tennessee in 1863, Samuel was 29. He stood in the town square with hundreds of others while a Union officer read the words aloud. People shouted and cried and danced, but Samuel felt something heavier. He already knew the difference between a piece of paper and real freedom. He spent the rest of his life trying to close that gap, teaching reading classes by lamplight, helping men write fair labor contracts, organizing voter registration even when it meant riding home after dark with a rifle across his saddle. Reconstruction. Tennessee was no gentle place. Night riders burned crosses on the hill above his house more than once. Twice masked men came for him, and twice neighbors standing watch sent them running. Friends vanished. Churches went up in flames. Samuel's gentle boyhood faith grew tougher, sharper. He told people straight out, God didn't keep us from needing rescue. He sent rescue through people willing to act. Prayer that doesn't get up and walk is just noise. One spring day in 1870, a thin, nervous white man knocked on Samuel's door. He gave his name as Thomas Harrow's Thaddeus's grandson. The boy had grown up hearing whispers about the family disgrace. He had found his grandfather's bitter journal full of shaky handwriting about curses and a praying child. Thomas offered Samuel a deed 40 acres that had once belonged to Willowbrook. He wanted to give something back. Samuel took the land, not because the apology fixed anything, but because land can be put to good use even when people can't. He cleared it, built a little schoolhouse, and named it Hope Academy. Children who had never owned a pencil learned their letters under that roof. As Samuel got older, writers and picture takers started showing up. In 1885, a photographer set up his big box camera on the porch and took a portrait. Samuel, at 41, hair already going gray, face carved deep with everything he'd lived through, eyes still steady. Grace stood beside him, their 3 children in front. and if you look close, you can just make out the corner of Hope Academy in the background. That picture got printed in newspapers up north to raise money for freedmen's schools. Samuel never saw a dime, and he didn't care. He just wanted folks to see proof that the scared boy in the dirt had built something that lasted. The years after Reconstruction turned mean. Jim Crow locked doors that had cracked open. Lynchings became a Sunday spectacle. The court said separate was equal, and everybody knew it was a lie. Samuel watched rights slip away, and it wore him down. In his last years, his preaching got fiercer. He told young people, "We waited, too gentle. Love your enemy, yes, but don't hand him the rope he plans to hang you with." Samuel died at 72, worn out but peaceful. He is buried under a cedar tree behind the church he helped raise. On his stone are carved the simplest words he ever spoke about that morning. I asked, help came. The story didn't stop with his grave. It still moves through kitchens and church basements, through college classrooms and family reunions, past, along like a torch nobody wants to let go out. Because every generation gets its own courtyard, its own Thaddeus, laughing, its own moment when everything looks hopeless, and every generation still needs to hear about the boy who knelt anyway, prayed anyway, and watched the impossible ride in, wearing dusty blue coats 10 minutes after the laugh. 10 minutes that changed everything. That's the part we get to carry forward. The refusal to let cruelty write the ending. The rest is up to us. Samuel came to believe that protecting your family and your neighbors was part of loving them. He taught men how to shoot straight, how to take turns keeping watch, how to hide money in papers, in case the night riders came. He helped start burial societies and crop-sharing groups, so no family went hungry or buried their dead without help. A lot of the white folks who once clapped him on the back for being reasonable suddenly found reasons to stay away. Samuel didn't chase their approval anymore. He was done proving his humanity to people who had already made up their minds. He died in the winter of 1898 at 64, taken by pneumonia that settled in his chest after a lifetime of hard work and harder winters. The little church couldn't hold everyone who came. People rode trains and wagons for days to stand in the cold and say goodbye. Preachers spoke, choirs sang, and one after another folks stood up to tell the same 10 minutes in George each, adding their own shade of wonder to it. Samuel's grown children sat in the front row, listening to stories about a daddy they never knew as a terrified boy. And they cried like they were hearing it for the first time. Hope Academy, the school he built on the land Thomas Harrov signed over, kept its doors open another 40 years. Hundreds of children learned to read and figure there. Many of them grew up to teach, to preach, to organize, to keep the story moving forward. When segregation finally choked the school to death, the building came down. But the learning didn't single quotes. In the 1960s, young activists, digging through dusty courthouse records and old newspapers found Samuel's name again. They found the photographs, the yellowed clippings, the speeches. Something about a 12-year-old who prayed while a slave owner laughed felt painfully familiar. They carried his words into meeting houses and jail cells and told the new generation that the same God who bent the ark was still listening. Today, if you drive past what used to be Willowbrook Plantation, you'll see a neat historical marker, put up in 1995. It talks about cotton yields in architecture and the labor system of the period. Samuel's name isn't on it. Martha's isn't either. The 10 minutes that changed everything aren't mentioned at all. The man who owns the land now wants to put in a golf course and says a more honest marker would hurt property values. Petitions sit unanswered, but memory doesn't ask permission. Every few years, Samuel's descendants, hundreds strong, now gather under shade trees or in church fellowship halls. An elder stands up, clears their throat, and starts the same way every time. It was a cold November morning in 1856. The children squirm, the teenagers roll their eyes a little, but they all lean in. Some hear it as a miracle straight from heaven. Others hear it as the best-timed coincidence in history. Doesn't matter. They all grow up knowing their people come from a long line of folks who refuse to let somebody else's laugh be the last word. Historians have checked the records. Yes, federal troops really did ride in that day. Yes, Thaddeus Harav was arrested, tried, and ruined for smuggling human beings. Those parts are filed and stamped. What the files can't measure is why the soldiers came. Exactly then, 10 minutes after a boy's prayer floated up into a silent sky, near the end of his life, a young researcher sat on Samuel's porch with a notebook and asked, straight out, "Mr. Samuel, do you believe God himself sent those soldiers?" Samuel rocked a minute, looked out over the fields his own hands had helped plant, and answered slow and sure, "I know I prayed with everything in me. I know they showed up. Whether the Lord reached down and moved the captain's hand, or whether my prayer just gave a scared little boy the strength to stand up and meet. Whatever came next, I can't swear to the mechanics of it, but I can tell you this. Faith changes things. Sometimes it changes the world. Every single time it changes the person doing the believing. I stood up a different child than the one who knelt down. That much I know for a fact. The rest, well, that's between you and whatever you decide to trust." That was Samuel, never loud about certainty, never small about hope. The boy who knelt in terror walked out of that courtyard free and spent the rest of his days making sure other people could walk free too. The man who laughed in cruelty died, broke, and forgotten, still trying to blame somebody else for the dust his empire turned into. Between those two endings stretches a whole long story of regular folks refusing to give despair the final say. The courtyard is gone. The chains are rust. But the story keeps traveling through kitchens, through classrooms, through bloodlines and history books, and quiet conversations after church, because every one of us will face a courtyard someday. Something or someone will laugh and tell us the story is already over, that cruelty wins, that hope is for children when that day comes. Somebody needs to be there to whisper what Samuel's people have been whispering for 170 years. Keep praying anyway. Keep standing anyway. You never know. 10 minutes is all it takes for everything to change. The impossible is still in the business of showing up.